Kalen held his breath until his lungs burned. He was 14, a runaway from a burned-out Earth Kingdom village, and his entire life had been defined by looking over his shoulder. He crouched beneath the massive, twisting roots of an ancient banyan grove tree, clutching a rusted carving knife that was more rust than metal. The ground beneath his calloused bare feet vibrated with a sickening rhythmic hum. It was the sound of Fire Nation steel. Through the thick emerald canopy of the forest, the jagged, soot-stained hulls of armored airships blotted out the midday sun. They were hunting. They were always hunting. Kalen closed his eyes, squeezing them tight against the smell of ozone and sulfur that always preceded the slaughter. He believed with the absolute certainty of a traumatized child that the world belonged to the firebenders. Fire consumed, fire destroyed. Flesh and wood could never beat metal and flame. But what if the rules of the universe suddenly broke? What if a war-torn world of elemental magic was violently introduced to a boy who held the power to shatter stars? What if the Avatar wasn't the most dangerous kid in the forest today? Kalen flinched as a sound unlike anything he had ever heard ripped through the heavens. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the boom of a fire blast. It sounded like the sky itself was screaming in agony. Kalen risked a glance upward, his jaw dropping in pure terror. The azure sky literally fractured. A jagged, blinding tear in the fabric of reality opened above the canopy, bleeding out a terrifying electric blue light that momentarily blinded him. From the center of that cosmic wound, a localized hurricane of pure, concussive energy blasted downward, snapping century-old tree trunks like dry twigs. And then something fell. It plummeted from the rift at an impossible speed, a blur of torn purple fabric and fading golden light. The impact struck the earth with the force of a meteor. The shockwave launched Kalen backward, tumbling head over heels through the dense ferns. A massive crater easily 50 paces wide had been carved into the ancient forest floor. Smoke hissed from the vitrified soil. The earth instantly turned to glass by the sheer friction of the arrival. Kalen scrambled onto his belly, peering over the jagged lip of the crater. Lying at the epicenter was not a weapon, it was a boy. He looked no older than Kalen, dressed in strange, shredded purple martial arts robes. The boy's hair was pitch black, and he was gasping for air, his body battered and bleeding from wounds that looked like they had been inflicted by a god. Kalen watched paralyzed as 3 other figures emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the crater, cautiously approaching the fallen stranger. The one leading the trio was a bald kid with bright blue arrow tattoos running down his head and arms gripping a wooden glider staff. Behind him, a girl with dark skin and blue clothes held her hands out, a sphere of pure water hovering magically between her palms. A taller teenager with a boomerang drawn flanked them, his eyes wide with paranoid disbelief. Kalen recognized the bald boy from the whispered legends in the refugee camps. The Avatar, the last hope of the world. But right now, our Avatar just looked like a confused kid staring at an alien. The boy in purple coughed, spitting out a mouthful of ash, and weakly propped himself up on one elbow. He didn't look hostile. In fact, despite the apocalyptic entrance, he smiled a goofy, disarming grin that completely defied the devastation around him. He raised a trembling hand in a casual greeting. The Water Tribe girl didn't hesitate. She slid down the glassed slopes of the crater, her hands glowing with a soft, luminescent blue light. She pressed the water against the stranger's deepest cuts. Kalen strained his ears, catching the boy's voice. It was soft, almost innocent. He asked if the glowing water was some kind of magic or a special application of ki. The Avatar laughed, a bright chiming sound in the grim forest, explaining it was waterbending. Placed his hands on his knees and without bending a single element, without moving the air or shifting the earth, he simply stood up. And then he kept going. The boy floated. He rose 3 feet into the air, crossing his legs, in a meditative posture, hovering with absolute effortless stillness. Kalen's breath hitched. The boomerang kid dropped his weapon, the metal clattering loudly against the vitrified rock. The Avatar's jaw went slack, his eyes shining with a mixture of profound shock and immediate childlike wonder. The laws of nature, the very foundations of how the world worked, were being casually ignored by a boy who was just smiling and stretching his neck. But the quiet moment of awe was violently butchered. The mechanical roar Kalen had feared returned, amplified 100-fold. The tree canopy above them burst into sudden violent flames as 3 Fire Nation airships descended directly over the clearing. The heat washed over Kalen's hiding spot, singeing his eyebrows. Dozens of heavy iron cables dropped from the iron bellies of the ships, and heavily armored Fire Nation soldiers began to fast rope down their helmets, gleaming with lethal intent. At the helm of the drop was a Fire Nation commander clad in ornate, jagged red armor. His face was twisted into a permanent sneer of superiority. He barked an order, and a coordinated volley of giant searing fireballs rained down upon the surrounding forest, instantly incinerating the ancient banyan trees. The message was clear: there was no escape. The soldiers formed a tight perimeter around the crater, their spears leveled at the Avatar and his friends. The commander stepped forward, his fists igniting with raw, aggressive flame. He demanded the immediate, unconditional surrender of the Avatar, promising that their deaths would be slow if they resisted. Kalen felt the familiar crushing weight of despair settle over his chest. This was it. The Avatar was cornered, exhausted, and outnumbered. The fire always wins. The bald boy stepped forward anyway, spinning his staff, ready to die fighting. The Water Tribe siblings raised their weapons, trembling but resolute. But the boy in purple floated down his bare feet, touching the scorched earth softly. He looked away from the soldiers. He was staring at the burning trees. The smell of incinerated wood and the sight of innocent life being casually destroyed did something to him. The goofy, innocent smile vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, harrowing grief. In the boy's mind, he wasn't seeing Fire Nation soldiers. Kalen could see the traumatic flashback playing out in the stranger's eyes. The boy's breathing grew ragged, heavy, and unnatural. He saw a different monster. He saw a mechanical head being crushed under a green speckled heel. He saw a perfect being torturing his father, his friends bleeding them dry for amusement. He saw a world choking on ash. The boy's fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles popped like breaking bones. He stepped in front of the Avatar, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm as he told them to stand back. The Fire Nation commander laughed an ugly, grating sound. He thrust his gauntlet forward, unleashing a massive, roaring pillar of concentrated white-hot fire directly at the boy's face. It was a kill shot. Kalen wanted to scream, to look away, but the boy didn't even blink. He didn't brace himself. He simply raised the back of his hand and swatted the air. A concussive shockwave of pure, invisible force erupted from his casual motion. It hit the roaring inferno and didn't just stop it, it deflected it. The massive pillar of fire was violently redirected upward, tearing through the sky and dispersing into harmless, fading embers a mile above the canopy. The forest fell into a suffocating, dead silence. The crackling of the burning trees seemed to mute itself. The commander's arrogant sneer dissolved into slack-jawed incomprehension. He looked at his gauntlet, then at the boy. The Avatar and his friends were frozen statues of pure disbelief. Kalen forgot how to breathe. The boy lowered his head, his untidy black hair casting a dark, terrifying shadow over his eyes. The ground beneath Kalen's feet began to hum. It wasn't the mechanical vibration of the airships anymore. It was a tectonic groan. Pebbles shattered wood and chunks of glassified earth began to defy gravity, floating upward into the air around the boy. The atmosphere grew impossibly thick. Kalen felt a crushing pressure against his lungs, like he was suddenly standing at the bottom of the ocean. The air tasted like copper and static electricity. A low, guttural growl escaped the boy's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak and bottomless rage. The growl built echoing off the mountains, rising into an earth-shattering, soul-tearing scream. The pressure snapped. A blinding, apocalyptic pillar of golden light erupted from the boy's body, piercing the dark smoke clouds of the firebenders and shooting straight into the stratosphere. The sheer concussive force of the light blasted the Fire Nation soldiers off their feet, hurling them like rag dolls into the burning brush. Kalen dug his fingers into the dirt, screaming as the shockwave flattened the grass around him. The very foundation of the Earth Kingdom shook, a localized earthquake, born not of shifting plates but of one soul's limitless fury. When the blinding light finally stabilized, the boy was gone. In his place stood a god. His once black hair was now spiked completely upward, blazing with a rigid, brilliant golden hue. Violent arcs of fierce blue lightning crackled and whipped frantically around his golden aura, scoring deep burn marks into the earth wherever they struck. His teal eyes were terrifyingly sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. There was no trace of the gentle, goofy kid who had smiled at the healing water moments ago. The Super Saiyan 2 had awakened. The remaining Fire Nation vanguard broke. Decades of imperial indoctrination shattered in a single second. Elite soldiers dropped their spears, fell to their knees, and openly wept in absolute terror. They knew with primal instinct that they were not facing a bender, they were facing an extinction event. Kalen watched his worldview disintegrating as the Golden God took a single step forward. The pressure of that single footfall cracked the bedrock beneath the crater, sending a massive fissure tearing through the soil. In the blink of an eye, the golden boy vanished. He didn't move fast. He simply ceased to exist in that physical space. High above the forest, a terrifying metallic screech ripped through the air. The armored airships, the pride of the Fire Nation Navy, suddenly crumpled. An invisible godlike force gripped their thick metal hulls and crushed them as easily as Kalen might crush a dried leaf in his palm. The colossal engines died instantly. The crumpled husks of the flying fortresses plummeted from the sky, falling harmlessly into a distant, uninhabited gorge. The golden boy reappeared exactly where he had been standing a microsecond before. His breathing was perfectly calm, his chest barely rising. He didn't even look at the terrified soldiers scrambling away into the underbrush. He raised one hand, extending 2 fingers toward the raging forest fire that the commander had started. He didn't breathe in. He didn't go through a bending form. He merely flicked his wrist and uttered a short, sharp shout, a ki. An invisible shockwave of pure, concentrated air pressure exploded from his fingers. It swept through the forest, ripping the oxygen away from the flames in a single devastating instant. The entire inferno was extinguished. The suffocating heat vanished, replaced by a sudden chilling breeze. The golden aura flickered and died. The violent lightning faded into nothingness. The boy's hair dropped softly, returning to its natural, untidy black. The apocalyptic pressure lifted off Kalen's chest, allowing him to gasp for sweet, cool air. Down in the crater, the boy turned around to face the Avatar. The cold, merciless stare was gone, instantly replaced by that same warm, innocent smile. He rubbed his stomach, letting out a loud, embarrassing groan. He casually mentioned that fighting always made him starving, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just dismantled a military strike force in 3 seconds. The Avatar, sitting flat on the scorched earth, completely paralyzed by shock, slowly began to smile back. Kalen remained hidden behind the banyan roots, his hands trembling violently. Everything he believed about power, about the Fire Nation's inevitable victory, had just been erased. But as he looked up at the sky where the golden beam had pierced the clouds, a new terrible realization dawned on him. That light was a beacon. Every general, every warlord, every monster on the continent had just felt that tremor. The forest was saved and Kalen's soul was forever changed, but the boy had just rung a bell that could never be unrung. The war hadn't ended. The scale had just become unimaginable. The scent of roasted lychee nuts and thick campfire smoke drifted through the shattered clearing, a violently normal aroma masking the apocalyptic crater just paces away. Kalen had not run. His survival instincts, honed by years of dodging Fire Nation patrols, screamed at him to flee into the darkening timberland. Yet his legs refused to move. He had dragged his battered, shivering body out of the vitrified ditch and crept closer to the flickering light of the Banyan Grove camp, hiding behind a thick, mossy log. His stomach gave a hollow, painful cramp. He hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days, but the hunger was overshadowed by a paralyzing, morbid fascination. Kalen watched the alien boy in the torn purple gi sitting cross-legged by the fire, entirely consuming a roasted boar cupine that Sokka had apparently been saving for a week. The boy ate with a ravenous, almost frightening intensity, stripping bones clean in fractions of a second. Kalen's worldview, built on the absolute terror of power, was struggling to process this. The being who had literally shattered the sky and casually crushed armored warships was currently licking grease off his fingers and apologizing for his manners. To Kalen, power was the Fire Nation commander burning a village to ash just to make a point. Power was cruel. Power was loud. This boy's absolute lack of malice was more terrifying than the golden lightning. It made no sense. Sitting against the massive furry flank of a 6-legged flying bison, the Avatar watched the spiky-haired boy with bright, inquisitive eyes. The adrenaline of the near-death encounter had faded, replaced by the relentless, bouncing curiosity of a 12-year-old monk. Aang couldn't contain himself. He sprang to his feet, spinning his wooden glider staff with a playful, whistling blur. The young Avatar bounced on the balls of his feet, an infectious grin spreading across his face as he challenged the stranger to a friendly sparring match. Kalen's breath hitched and he instinctively pressed his face into the damp dirt behind his log. Was the bald kid insane? You do not invite a walking extinction event to play fight. Kalen waited for the golden light to return for the boy in purple to take offense and vaporize the camp. Instead, a warm, booming chuckle echoed across the clearing. Gohan scratched the back of his head, his face flushing with genuine humility, and agreed to the match. He promised to hold back his strength, swearing not to use the explosive golden energy, relying purely on his basic martial arts. Sokka groaned loudly from a nearby stump, crossing his arms and aggressively muttering about the sheer mathematical unfairness of a kid smaller than him possessing enough raw force to punch a geographic hole through a mountain range. Aang initiated the bout without a second of hesitation, leaping into the night air with the impossible weightless grace of a falling leaf. He swung his glider staff downward, carving a sweeping compressed blade of howling air directly at Gohan's chest. From his hiding spot, Kalen heard the sheer, lethal velocity of the wind blade. It sounded like a massive scythe cutting through tall grass. He flinched, expecting the purple-clad boy to be cleaved in two. Instead of bracing, instead of blocking, Gohan simply tilted his chin half an inch to the left. The invisible roaring current of compressed air ruffled his untidy black hair as it sliced through the empty space just millimeters from his nose, impacting the forest floor behind him and carving a deep, smoking trench into the dirt. Gohan hadn't even blinked. His hands remained casually resting at his sides. Kalen's eyes widened in the dark. It wasn't just raw, world-breaking power that this boy possessed. It was a level of physical perfection and spatial awareness that defied human anatomy. He wasn't out-muscling the Avatar's bending. He was simply existing exactly where the attack was not. Realizing that a straightforward ranged assault was completely useless, Aang didn't pause to reconsider. He landed softly on a rapidly swirling sphere of wind, his signature air scooter, and began zipping around Gohan in rapid, utterly unpredictable, chaotic circles. The whirring sound of the compressed air filled the clearing like a swarm of angry hornets. Aang launched a relentless, rapid-fire barrage of concussive air blasts from every conceivable angle, aiming to overwhelm the stranger's senses. Kalen could barely track the Avatar's movements. He was just a blur of orange and yellow cloth. But Gohan didn't track the blur. He closed his eyes. His body began to move with a fluid, terrifying precision. He swayed like a willow branch in a hurricane. He ducked, pivoted, and leaned back, his movements so utterly minimal yet so mathematically perfect that Aang's furious attacks hit nothing but the phantom silhouettes of where Gohan had been a fraction of a microsecond before. The air blasts detonated harmlessly against the trees and the ground, kicking up clouds of dust, but Gohan remained perfectly centered, a calm eye in the middle of a violent storm. Frustrated but visibly thrilled by the impossible challenge, Aang closed the distance entirely. He abandoned the air blasts and engaged in close-quarters combat, utilizing his incredibly agile, evasive airbending forms to deliver a dizzying flurry of sweeping kicks and rapid palm strikes. The sharp, percussive smacks of physical impacts finally rang out across the firelight. Gohan met the Avatar blow for blow, but Kalen noticed something profoundly strange about the exchange. Gohan's blocks were gentle. He wasn't striking Aang's limbs. He was intercepting them with open palms, absorbing the kinetic energy and guiding the strikes away with an immovably firm yet entirely painless redirection. It was like watching a master gracefully dance with a child. When Aang attempted a low, spinning sweep to take the boy's legs out from under him, Gohan simply hopped. He didn't jump high. He hopped perfectly, planting his bare foot softly and deliberately onto the very wooden staff Aang was using as a balancing fulcrum. The sudden, calculated shift in weight threw the Avatar completely off kilter, sending Aang stumbling forward into the dirt with a surprised yelp. Aang burst out laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy echoing through the grim canopy of Kalen's war-torn world. The Avatar pushed himself off the ground, his eyes shining with competitive fire. He planted his feet wide and began to channel a massive roaring funnel of wind around his own body. Kalen clamped his hands over his ears as the deafening howl of a localized hurricane drowned out the crackle of the campfire. Leaves, loose dirt, and heavy branches were sucked into the violent vortex as Aang transformed himself into a miniature raging tornado. The Avatar charged forward, the sheer centrifugal force tearing up the ground, intending to physically sweep the impossibly sturdy stranger off his feet and launch him into the canopy. Kalen shrank behind the log, certain the campsite was about to be obliterated, but Gohan just smiled. It wasn't a smile of arrogance, but of deep nostalgic appreciation. His Saiyan blood relished the thrill of a pure, highly technical martial arts exchange. Rather than backing away, rather than summoning his golden aura, Gohan stepped directly forward. He walked right into the raging, shrieking teeth of the vortex. From his vantage point, Kalen witnessed something that finally broke his understanding of reality. Without summoning a single ounce of glowing energy, without taking a bending stance, Gohan simply read the chaotic flow of the violent wind currents. He slipped through the microscopic gaps in the hurricane's pressure walls, his body moving with the slipstream rather than fighting it. In the blink of an eye, Gohan emerged right in the dead center of the tornado, standing face to face with the astonished Avatar. Before Aang could react, Gohan delivered a lightning-fast, open-palm strike aimed squarely at the boy's chest. But the strike never landed. Gohan halted his hand exactly 1 millimeter from Aang's robes. The sheer, overwhelming physical force of the halted momentum had nowhere to go. It violently displaced the air, generating a massive, non-lethal concussive shockwave of pure atmospheric pressure. The blast shattered the tornado, instantly blowing Aang's glider clean out of his hands and sending the Avatar tumbling backward through the air, landing safely in a massive pile of soft, gathered autumn leaves on the edge of the camp. Absolute silence fell over the clearing for a heavy, breathless second. The dust settled slowly. Then Aang erupted into a fit of breathless, joyous laughter, playfully tossing leaves into the air as he brushed his robes off. Katara stood up from her log, her hands clapping enthusiastically, her face illuminated with profound amazement at the sheer lethal discipline she had just witnessed. Sokka, however, dramatically threw both his hands straight up into the air, staring at the sky as if demanding an audience with the spirits. He loudly declared that the fundamental laws of physics had officially been cancelled, and he was formally submitting his resignation to the universe. Gohan walked over and offered Aang a hand, up his innocent, goofy smile returning to his face. He complimented the Avatar's incredible agility and unique fighting style, completely and entirely unaware that he had just redefined the upper limits of combat in a world historically dominated by element-manipulating warlords. Kalen slowly lowered his head behind the log. His chest felt tight. For his entire life, the boy had believed that overwhelming power could only be utilized for terror and subjugation, but this godlike entity capable of vaporizing armadas had just engaged in combat and chosen not to leave a single bruise. The realization hit Kalen like a physical blow. Power wasn't inherently evil. The Fire Nation wasn't an unavoidable law of nature. The campfire burned lower as the night deepened, casting long, erratic shadows across the faces of the weary travelers. The sheer, jaw-dropping spectacle of Gohan's pure martial arts demonstration had left the Avatar team in a state of profound, lingering awe, but the quiet of the forest was deceptive. Kalen remained glued to his hiding spot, his hunger gnawing at his ribs, but he dared not make a sound. He listened intently as Aang, unable to sleep and staring into the dancing flames, asked the question that had been burning in Kalen's own mind. How did he move like that? How did he generate such world-breaking force without bending the air or the fire or the earth around him? Gohan sat cross-legged, his teal eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers. He spoke softly, his voice carrying a weight of experience far beyond his teenage years. He explained the concept of Kai. He described it as the internal dormant life force that exists within every single living being, fundamentally and entirely different from the external manipulation of elemental nature that defined the benders of this world. While bending required an innate spiritual affinity, for the physical elements, Ki demanded absolute agonizing physical and mental discipline to harness, condense, and weaponize one's own internal spirit. Kalen pressed his forehead against the rough bark of the log. Every living being. The words echoed in his hollow chest. The Fire Nation had told the world that only benders mattered, that the non-benders, the weak, the ordinary, were destined to serve or burn. But this boy, this alien god who could crack the sky, was sitting by a fire casually explaining that true power wasn't a genetic lottery of the elements. It was the cultivation of the soul. For the first time in his miserable, terrified existence, Kalen felt a tiny, fragile spark of something utterly alien to him. Hope. If Kai existed in every living being, then it existed in him. He wasn't inherently broken, he wasn't destined to be a victim, but the fragile, beautiful illusion of safety was abruptly shattered by the cold, analytical voice of reason. Sokka was pacing back and forth on the opposite side of the fire, his boots crunching loudly against the dry leaves. The Water Tribe warrior was biting his thumbnail, his brow furrowed in deep tactical distress. He stopped abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at the blackened, glassified crater just visible in the gloom. He outlined a terrifyingly logical, fatal flaw in their current moment of peace. Sokka's voice cracked slightly as he laid out the grim reality. The massive, blinding pillar of golden light that Gohan had emitted earlier to vaporize the airships wasn't just a defensive maneuver. It was an astronomical flare. It was a beacon of pure, unrestrained energy that had undoubtedly been witnessed by every single Fire Nation military installation, lookout tower, and naval dreadnought within a 100-mile radius. Sokka's logic was flawless, cutting through the awe and replacing it with immediate freezing dread. You do not detonate a star in the middle of a war zone and expect to go unnoticed. Kalen's newfound hope evaporated instantly, replaced by the familiar suffocating grip of terror. He didn't need Sokka to explain the military implications. Kalen's finely tuned survival instincts, the ones that kept him alive in the burned-out ruins of his home, had already picked up the subtle shift in the environment. The forest had gone dead silent. The crickets had stopped chirping. The nocturnal predatory birds had fled. And then Kalen felt it. It started as a vibration in the soles of his dirty feet, translating up through his shins. A low, continuous rhythmic thrumming deep within the earth. It wasn't the scattered, clumsy hum of the standard patrol ships that Gohan had destroyed earlier. This vibration was heavier, more synchronized, and far more deliberate. It was the distinct, terrifying acoustic signature of heavy ironclad war machines moving with elite predatory stealth. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. He knew that sound. Every refugee in the Earth Kingdom had nightmares to that specific rhythm. The temperature in the clearing began to rise, not from the dying embers of the campfire, but from an external suffocating heat that seemed to bleed out from the dark spaces between the trees. Kalen clutched his rusted carving knife, his knuckles turning white. The illusion was over. The golden beacon had summoned the worst the world had to offer, and this time Kalen knew they wouldn't just be dropping fireballs from the sky. The monsters were already on the ground, and the shadows were closing in. The unnatural heat hit Kalen first, rolling through the dense underbrush like a physical suffocating tide. It wasn't the warm, comforting ambient glow of the Banyan Grove campfire that had kept him company from the shadows. This heat was sharp, aggressive, and entirely predatory. The damp moss beneath his blistered feet began to dry and curl inward, sizzling faintly against the sudden spike in temperature. Kalen pressed his chest flat against the cold earth behind the rotting log, his rusted carving knife slipping slightly in his sweat-slicked palm. The rhythmic, terrifying thrum of the approaching war machines had abruptly ceased, replaced by a silence so profound and heavy it made Kalen's eardrums ache. The nocturnal insects were completely mute. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath in sheer terror, and then the darkness of the forest was violently, instantaneously banished. A perfectly circular, towering ring of blinding cobalt blue fire erupted from the earth, completely encircling the campsite and cutting off every conceivable avenue of escape. The sheer intensity of the blue flames vaporized the moisture in the air, creating a localized pressure dome that trapped the Avatar, his friends, and the alien stranger inside a lethal sapphire arena. Kalen knew what blue fire meant. Every refugee, every orphan, every broken soul wandering the scorched earth kingdom knew the whispered horrific legends of the Fire Lord's prodigy. They said her flames burned hotter than the sun. They said she lacked the fundamental human capacity for mercy. Princess Azula had not just found them. She had trapped them in an inescapable cage of her own design. The blue glare cast long skeletal shadows across the terrified faces of Katara and Sokka, who instantly drew their weapons, their eyes wide with the sudden freezing realization of their impending deaths. Aang gripped his wooden glider staff, his knuckles turning white, but the playful, bouncing energy of the young monk was entirely gone, replaced by the grim, heavy burden of a war he could not outrun. The flames parted momentarily, and a figure stepped through the localized inferno, as if strolling through a garden. Princess Azula wore the intricate crimson and gold armor of the Fire Nation royal family, her posture radiating an aura of absolute untouchable supremacy. A cruel, razor-sharp smile played across her lips, her amber eyes reflecting the cold, calculating intellect of a born apex predator. But Azula was not alone. Flanking her on all sides, stepping silently from the shadows of the blue flames, were a dozen figures clad in the dark green conical hats and rigid uniforms of the Earth Kingdom's most feared secret police, the Dai Li. Kalen's breath hitched a whimper dying in his throat. To see the cultural enforcers of Ba Sing Se marching in lockstep with the princess of the Fire Nation was a psychological blow that shattered whatever fragile reality Kalen had left. The betrayal was absolute. The world was entirely broken. The Dai Li moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, their rock gloves grinding audibly as they assumed combat stances, reinforcing the perimeter of the blue fire with an inner ring of lethal floating earth projectiles. The ambush was flawlessly executed. In a matter of seconds, the Avatar had been completely outmaneuvered, boxed in by the highest echelon of military lethality the world had ever produced. Kalen waited for Azula to demand Aang's surrender. He waited for the gloating speech about capturing the world's last hope. But Azula did something entirely unprecedented. She walked straight past the Avatar. She didn't even acknowledge Aang's existence. Her amber eyes, sharp as hunting daggers, were locked onto the boy in the torn purple martial arts robes. She had tracked the astronomical energy spike. She had felt the tectonic vibration of the golden light that had vaporized her armada's vanguard. She wasn't here for a philosophical victory. She was here to claim the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. Azula stopped 3 paces from the campfire, her hands clasped behind her back. In a display of supreme, arrogant confidence, she spoke, her voice smooth, silken, and dripping with venomous authority. She demanded that the golden boy surrender to her immediately. She offered him a place at the right hand of the Fire Lord, promising him unparalleled authority, boundless resources, and the absolute freedom to conquer a world that was begging to be ruled. Her words were a psychological snare designed to appeal to the ego of a being capable of breaking the sky. From his hiding spot, Kalen watched the boy in purple. Gohan did not look intimidated. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly tired. Slowly, deliberately, Gohan stood up, dusting the dirt off his shredded GI. He stepped calmly between Azula's towering blue fire and the paralyzed forms of Aang, Katara, and Sokka. His body shifted, his muscles tightening subtly under his clothing, his untidy black hair silhouetted against the roaring inferno. His teal eyes met Azula's calculated amber gaze, and the atmosphere in the clearing instantly hardened. Kalen felt the sheer, crushing weight of Gohan's internal discipline rolling off him in waves. Gohan was not an alien child. He was a battle-hardened god who had seen the absolute worst the universe could vomit into existence. He politely but firmly declined Azula's offer, stating with an icy, devastating calm that he had already seen enough arrogant tyrants in his own world to last several lifetimes. The casual dismissal hung in the superheated air like a physical blow. Azula's cruel smile did not waver, but her amber eyes instantly hardened into cold, sociopathic rage. Her ego had been publicly, effortlessly fractured. No one rejected the princess. No one looked at her as a minor inconvenience. Her brain immediately shifted to the tactical destruction of the boy's psyche. The golden anomaly was too sturdy to break physically, but he clearly possessed the agonizing, pathetic flaw of a protector's complex. He had positioned himself as a shield. Azula's hands snapped forward in a fluid, terrifying martial arts form, not aimed at Gohan but deliberately and viciously bypassing him. Her fingertips began to separate the negative and positive energies of the universe. The air pressure dropped violently. The smell of ozone overpowered the scent of smoke. The blinding, localized crackle of raw plasma roared into existence between her two index fingers. She generated a massive, jagged arc of pure, lethal blue lightning, testing the stranger's reaction speed by firing the unblockable execution technique directly at Katara's chest. From Kalen's perspective, the world abruptly slowed into a horrifying, crawling nightmare. The waterbender's eyes widened, reflecting the blinding blue death spiraling toward her. Aang screamed, but his voice sounded distorted, warped by the sheer speed of the discharging lightning. The lethality of the attack was absolute. There was no time to raise a wall of ice. There was no time to bend the air out of the way. Lightning was a death sentence, but Kalen watched Gohan. The boy in purple did not scream. He did not flare his golden aura. He didn't even widen his stance. He simply engaged instincts honed by fighting a biomechanical horror that had tortured his father. The space between Gohan and Katara seemed to compress, fold, and shatter. He vanished. Kalen did not see a blur of movement. He saw the complete absence of a physical body where Gohan had been, and the immediate instant reappearance of that body directly in the path of the killing strike. What followed was a moment of sheer mind-bending impossibility. The jagged, roaring bolt of blue lightning struck, but it didn't hit water, earth, or air. It hit the open palm of an extended hand. Gohan caught the lethal plasma strike barehanded. The crackling, screaming blue energy violently coiled around his forearm, furiously trying to ground itself into his body, illuminating the entire banyan grove in a terrifying strobe-like sequence of blinding light and pitch-black shadows. Kalen squeezed his eyes shut momentarily, his brain utterly unable to process the physics of a human being physically grasping the raw, unadulterated anger of the sky. When he forced his eyes open, he saw Gohan's expression. The boy's face was entirely perfectly calm. The veins in his arm bulged slightly under the immense strain of the electrical current, but his teal eyes were steady. He was holding millions of volts of pure death as easily as one might hold a struggling sparrow in their palm. Without breaking eye contact with the stunned Princess, Gohan rotated his wrist in a fluid sweeping motion. He redirected the massive current of lightning, guiding the raw energy up his arm across his shoulders and violently hurling it straight up into the night sky. The redirected bolt erupted upward like a geyser of blue fire, tearing a massive smoking hole through the thick emerald canopy of the banyan grove. The lightning detonated in the stratosphere with the deafening, earth-shaking concussive boom of a localized thunderstorm. The shockwaves scattered the dark clouds above the valley, turning the midnight sky a brilliant, blinding white for a fraction of a second. The deafening echo of the thunderclap rolled over the mountains, vibrating in Kalen's chest and rattling the rusted carving knife in his paralyzed grip. Azula's arrogant smirk did not just falter, it completely and utterly shattered. The mask of infallible perfection cracked wide open, revealing an expression of sheer primal disbelief. The air in her lungs caught in a silent, horrified gasp. The fundamental rules of her universe, the absolute certainty of her power, had just been effortlessly swatted aside by a kid who was apologizing for his manners minutes earlier. No one could catch lightning. It was physically impossible without performing the incredibly specific, highly spiritual redirection technique derived from waterbenders. And certainly absolutely no one could catch a lethal full-power strike with a single bare hand and hold it without being instantly vaporized. The psychological impact on the Fire Nation's deadliest weapon was instantaneous. For the first time in her life, Princess Azula felt the cold, suffocating grip of true fear wrapping around her spine. Sensing the unprecedented momentary panic of their commander, the Dai Li agents engaged their elite conditioning. They operated entirely outside of awe or fear. They launched a synchronized, devastating counteroffensive, moving in perfect unison. A dozen agents stomped the ground simultaneously, summoning massive, jagged pillars of solid bedrock that ripped horizontally from the earth. The colossal boulders, weighing several tons each, hurtled across the clearing at terrifying speeds, converging on Gohan from all sides, intending to crush the alien threat into an unrecognizable bloody pulp. The sheer, overwhelming mass of the coordinated earthbending attack would have flattened a battalion of standard soldiers. But Kalen had stopped expecting standard results. He barely flinched as Gohan turned his head slightly toward the incoming onslaught. Gohan let out a short, sharp exhalation of breath, channeling an infinitesimal fraction of his dormant ki into his leg muscles. He didn't assume a stance. He didn't brace himself. He executed a sweeping, blindingly fast roundhouse kick that tore through the air with a supersonic crack. His shin impacted the lead boulder with the force of a falling meteor. The collision did not stop the rock. It entirely pulverized the solid earth into harmless, microscopic dust before it even grazed his GI. The concussive shockwave of the physical impact alone rippled outward, catching the synchronized Dai Li agents squarely in the chest. They were violently blown off their feet, sent flying backward like discarded ragdolls crashing into the thick trunks of the banyan trees. The absolute, effortless dismantling of the Earth Kingdom's most feared killers left Kalen staring in mute, profound revelation. The invincible Fire Nation, the untouchable Earth Elite, they were nothing. They were arrogant children playing with matches and mud in the face of a true, unyielding god. But the immediate, visceral triumph of survival was brutally cut short. Kalen's sharp hearing, trained to listen for distant patrols, picked up a terrifying, rumbling secondary sound echoing down from the jagged peaks high above the valley. The deafening boom of the redirected lightning had not been harmless. The concussive force of the atmospheric detonation had struck the unstable snow-capped summit of the nearest mountain range. Kalen's blood ran colder than the winter winds. The illusion of safety was entirely gone. The secrecy of their remote camp was permanently shattered, and high above them, an avalanche of ice rock and burning debris was plummeting toward the small, sleeping Earth Kingdom village in the valley below. The low, terrifying rumble did not begin in Kalen's ears. It started deep within the marrow of his bones. It was a heavy, grinding vibration that traveled down from the jagged, snow-capped peaks, looming high above the banyan grove, seeping into the earth and turning the very bedrock into a tuning fork of impending doom. Kalen pressed his cheek against the damp soil behind his rotting log, his eyes widening in the pitch-black shadows. He knew that sound. It wasn't the rhythmic, metallic marching of Fire Nation armor, nor was it the concussive boom of artillery fire. It was the sound of geology failing. The redirected lightning bolt, hurled into the stratosphere with godlike force, had struck the unstable summit of Mount Makapu. Millions of tons of ancient ice, fractured granite, and burning timber were suddenly entirely divorced from gravity. An avalanche of apocalyptic proportions had just been triggered, and it was currently in freefall, accelerating down the sheer slopes directly toward the sprawling, unsuspecting Earth Kingdom refugee village nestled in the deep valley below. For Kalen, the horror was immediate, vivid, and paralyzing. He had slept in that village. He knew the frail patchwork roofs of the refugee tents. He knew the smell of the communal soup kitchens, the hollow faces of the orphans, and the desperate, exhausted silence of people who had already lost everything to the war. They were asleep. They had no warning sirens. The sheer, overwhelming mass of the falling mountain would not simply crush them. It would bury them alive beneath 100 feet of pulverized rock, suffocating the entire settlement in a single devastating heartbeat. Kalen's breath caught in his throat, a pathetic, strangled whimper escaping his lips. He squeezed his eyes shut, his dirty fingernails digging frantically into the moss. The illusion of safety he had felt just moments ago, the fragile hope inspired by the golden god who refused to kill, was violently ripped away. The scale of the war hadn't just escalated, it had transcended human comprehension. The clash of titans in the forest was about to demand a blood price in the valley, and the currency was innocent lives. Gohan's head snapped sharply toward the dark horizon, his spiky black hair whipping across his forehead. The alien boy's superhuman senses were already filtering through the chaotic, localized noise of the battlefield, pushing past the crackle of Azula's blue fire and the groans of the incapacitated ATLA agents. He didn't just hear the geographical collapse. He heard the microscopic, terrifying details. He heard the supersonic cracking of monolithic boulders shearing away from the mountain face. He heard the violent, rushing displacement of the frigid mountain air. And most agonizingly of all, he heard the faint, distant awakening screams of the villagers as the apocalyptic rumble finally reached their homes. The calm, calculated martial artist vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. Gohan realized the horrifying truth of his own strength. Princess Azula was nothing but a minor, localized distraction. The real danger, the true lethal threat, was the catastrophic collateral damage of his own deflected defense. He had saved one girl, but in doing so, he had inadvertently condemned 1,000 souls to a suffocating, crushing death. The psychological shift in the clearing was violent and instantaneous. Gohan entirely dropped his combat stance. He turned his back completely on Princess Azula, presenting his unprotected spine to the deadliest firebender on the continent in a display of absolute ultimate dismissal. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. He simply did not care about her anymore. He locked eyes with Aang, who was still staring at the crushed ATLA agents in absolute shock. Gohan's voice did not echo with godly authority. It cracked with the desperate, frantic urgency of a teenager terrified of failing. He barked an order, his words sharp and commanding, urging the Avatar to get Katara and Sokka onto the flying bison immediately and fly to the highest possible altitude. The battle in the forest was over. The priority was pure, immediate survival. Aang blinked, the sheer gravity of Gohan's panic snapping him out of his paralysis. The young monk didn't hesitate or ask questions. He grabbed his glider staff, signaling his friends to move with a frantic whistling sweep of his arm. Azula stood amidst the dying embers of her blue fire, her chest heaving, her pristine royal armor covered in the microscopic dust of pulverized earth. The sheer, unmitigated disrespect of the boy turning his back on her shattered the last remaining fragments of her cold, sociopathic composure. Her amber eyes burned with an unhinged, rabid fury. She was the princess of the Fire Nation. She dictated who lived and who died. She was the absolute center of gravity in any conflict. To be ignored, to be treated as an irrelevant nuisance while the enemy focused on a falling rock, was a psychological violation she could not fathom. With a guttural, feral scream that tore at her throat, Azula thrust both of her hands forward. She abandoned the precise, calculated forms of lightning generation and unleashed a massive, chaotic torrent of blinding, superheated blue plasma aimed directly at Gohan's exposed back. It was a desperate, ugly attack fueled by nothing but bruised ego and pure, venomous hatred. But the blue inferno never reached its target. Kalen watched his jaw slack in absolute awe as Gohan didn't even bother to turn around to block. Instead, a blinding, brilliant aura of pure white ki violently erupted from the boy's body. It wasn't the jagged, destructive golden light from earlier. This was a smooth, roaring, ethereal flame that illuminated the forest with the intensity of a dying star. The sheer, instantaneous atmospheric displacement of the aura's ignition created a concussive barrier of pure outward pressure. Azula's massive torrent of blue fire hit the invisible wall of ki and violently washed over it, parting around Gohan like river water striking a massive, immovable boulder. The flames dissipated harmlessly into the canopy, leaving Gohan completely untouched. He crouched low to the ground, the white aura flaring higher, the earth beneath his feet instantly cratering under the immense gathering kinetic load. With a deafening supersonic crack that physically shattered the remaining glassified rocks in the crater, Gohan launched himself into the night sky. He broke the sound barrier from a dead standstill. The explosive shockwave of his liftoff flattened. The tall grass snapped the surrounding banyan branches and violently hurled Princess Azula backward into the dirt, entirely upending her royal dignity. Kalen squeezed his hands over his eardrums screaming in agony as the sonic boom echoed off the canyon walls. Gohan tore through the dark clouds like a reverse meteor, a brilliant ascending streak of white light that painted the sky in sharp, hyper-contrasted shadows. He climbed higher and faster than any airship, any dragon, or any flying bison ever could. He was not flying, he was conquering the very concept of gravity through sheer tyrannical willpower. Kalen scrambled up onto the rotting log, his fear entirely eclipsed by the morbid, breathless necessity to witness the impossible. High above the dark, sprawling valley, the true apocalyptic scale of the disaster finally became visible. A colossal, jagged shadow was consuming the moonlight. An entire flank of Mount Makapu had sheared off and was plummeting downward, a terrifying, churning tidal wave of jagged granite boulders, ancient glaciers, and splintered pine trees. The leading edge of the avalanche was a suffocating wall of white snow and gray rock dust, rolling forward with the unstoppable, mindless momentum of a natural disaster. Below it, the tiny, flickering orange lights of the refugee village looked tragically pathetic, like a handful of fireflies waiting to be crushed by an anvil. Kalen's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. The falling mountain was too wide to catch. It was too massive to deflect. There was no physical structure in the world, no wall of earth or shield of ice that could halt millions of tons of accelerating bedrock. The valley was already a graveyard. The bodies just hadn't been buried yet. But the ascending white star did not attempt to catch the mountain. Gohan positioned himself in the dead center of the empty sky, floating directly between the falling apocalypse and the sleeping village. He was a microscopic speck of light against the colossal, crushing darkness of the descending avalanche. Kalen squinted, straining his eyes against the violent winds whipping through the valley. Gohan stabilized his flight, his white aura burning fiercely against the freezing high-altitude air. He spread his legs wide, adopting a deep, grounded martial arts stance in the middle of the empty sky. He drew both of his arms back to his right side, placing the base of his palms together, his fingers curling inward as if gently holding an invisible, fragile sphere. The boy took a slow, deep, terrifyingly calm breath. The frantic panic of his realization was entirely gone, replaced by the absolute lethal focus of a warrior who held the power to unmake reality. The air in the valley abruptly stopped moving. The howling wind died. The screeching of the falling rocks seemed to mute itself. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Between Gohan's cupped, glowing hands, a spark of energy ignited. It wasn't the jagged electricity of Azula's lightning, nor the chaotic heat of firebending. It was a perfect, concentrated, blindingly bright blue sphere of pure condensed Kai. The sphere began to hum. It was a low, resonant, synthetic vibration that Kalen felt in his teeth, a sound that defied the natural acoustics of the world. The blue light intensified violently, strobing and expanding, casting an ethereal, oceanic glow over the entire valley. The sheer density of the gathering energy began to warp the air around Gohan, bending the moonlight and creating a visible rippling halo of atmospheric distortion. Kalen could barely keep his eyes open, but he refused to look away. He was watching a mortal boy synthesize the power of a dying sun. Gohan's muscles corded the fabric of his torn purple gi, whipping violently in the localized gravity well generated by the energy sphere. The blue light grew so intense that it completely washed out the massive shadow of the falling mountain. The leading edge of the avalanche, massive boulders the size of warships, was mere seconds away from crushing him out of the sky. But Gohan did not flinch. He did not rush the technique. He waited for the absolute mathematically perfect fraction of a second. When the falling death was so close that the frigid rock dust coated his skin, Gohan thrust his cupped hands violently forward. He didn't just release the energy, he pushed it out of his soul with a deafening, earth-shattering roar that echoed with the combined acoustic force of 100 thunderstorms. Kamehameha. A colossal roaring river of concentrated blinding blue energy erupted from his palms. The beam was massive, easily wider than the largest Fire Nation dreadnought, a continuous screaming torrent of pure, unadulterated concussive light. It tore upward through the freezing air, a vertical pillar of localized destruction that connected the tiny floating boy to the massive descending mountain. The visual impact was entirely incomprehensible to Kalen's primitive understanding of physics. When the roaring blue beam collided with the vanguard of the avalanche, there was no explosion of shattered rock. There was no concussive shockwave of physical collision. The energy wave was vibrating at such a terrifyingly high frequency that it bypassed structural damage entirely and moved straight into molecular annihilation. The colossal granite boulders, the jagged slabs of ancient glacier ice, and the massive splintered trunks of the mountain pines did not simply break apart. They were instantly, entirely vaporized. The Kamehameha wave acted like a cosmic eraser scrubbing the falling mass from existence. The blinding blue light swallowed the entire center mass of the avalanche, rendering the stone into a superheated glowing plasma before instantly cooling it into something completely harmless. Kalen watched weeping openly from the sheer, overwhelming sensory overload as the terrifying lethal shadow of the falling mountain was violently transmuted. The roaring blue beam persisted, sweeping slightly left and right, acting as a godlike broom that swept the sky clean of death. The deafening hum of the energy wave drowned out the sound of the collapsing mountain, replacing the audio of a natural disaster with the synthetic roaring symphony of absolute controlled power. When Gohan finally cut the flow of ki, the sudden absence of the blinding blue light plunged the valley back into a muted, shocking darkness. Kalen blinked rapidly. His retinas burned with the phantom afterimage of the blue beam. The air was entirely silent. The earth had stopped vibrating. He looked up expecting to see the remnants of the avalanche crashing down upon the village roofs. Instead, he saw a miracle. The massive boulders and lethal ice chunks had been completely eradicated. In their place, a gentle shimmering cloud of microscopic, perfectly round grains of warm sand drifted downward. It looked like a localized golden snowfall catching the pale light of the moon as it gently rained over the thatched roofs and silent streets of the refugee village. It made a soft hissing sound as it landed, harming absolutely no one, burying nothing but the footprints in the dirt. Back at the Banyan Grove camp, the deafening silence was broken only by the frantic, heavy panting of Princess Azula. She was kneeling in the dirt, her pristine armor scuffed, her hair disheveled. She stared up at the sky, her amber eyes wide, hollow, and utterly devoid of their usual arrogant fire. She had formulated countless tactical plans in her short life. She knew how to manipulate Earth Kings, how to break generals, and how to burn fleets. But there was no tactical doctrine, no strategic countermeasure for a boy who could look at a falling mountain and simply decide it no longer existed. Realizing with absolute freezing certainty that she was entirely outmatched by an entity who operated completely outside the established laws of physics, Azula slowly mechanically rose to her feet. She did not issue a threat. She did not promise revenge. She simply melted backward into the dark shadows of the forest, retreating like a wounded predator, her mind furiously attempting to process a new, terrifying reality. A heavy, rhythmic gust of wind suddenly washed over the clearing. Appa, the massive flying bison, took off into the night sky, his 6 legs paddling frantically through the air. Aang, Katara, and Sokka clung to the heavy leather saddle, their faces pale, their eyes locked on the spot in the sky where the blue beam had just unmade a mountain. They were safe, but the fundamental reality of their journey had been irrevocably shattered. As the bison climbed higher, Gohan descended from the clouds. He landed softly, almost silently, onto the back of the massive saddle, his white aura completely extinguished. He dropped to his knees, his shoulders slumped, his breathing slightly elevated but completely unharmed. He looked down at his own trembling hands, the palms still radiating a faint residual heat. Kalen remained on the rotting log, his rusted carving knife forgotten in the dirt below. He felt a profound heavy ache in his chest, an emotional exhaustion that ran deeper than his physical hunger. The village was safe. He was alive. But Kalen knew with absolute certainty that the world was forever changed. The secrecy of the banyan grove was gone. The mountain peak was missing. And the Fire Nation's deadliest prodigy was currently retreating with the knowledge that a god walked among mortals. Kalen stared at the retreating silhouette of the flying bison, his fear replaced by a strange, heavy sense of duty. The boy in purple had saved the valley, but his blinding light had exposed them all to an entirely new scale of war. The rules were broken, and the entire world would soon be forced to pay the price for a power it could not hope to control. The next dawn would bring a different kind of fire, and Kalen knew there was no going back to the shadows. The adrenaline that had sustained Kalen through the night finally began to curdle into a sickening, heavy exhaustion as the first gray light of dawn bled over the jagged peaks of the valley. He had not stopped running since the flying bison disappeared into the clouds. His bare feet were bruised and bleeding, cut by the sharp slate of the mountain paths, but the terror of remaining in the banyan grove had propelled him forward. He was following the massive, unmistakable shadow that Appa had cast against the moonlight, tracking their trajectory toward the only safe harbor left in this sector of the continent. It was the walled refugee stronghold of Osen, a massive ancient quarry carved deep into the floor of a sheer-sided canyon. Kalen's lungs burned, each breath tasting of copper and cold dust, but his mind was completely consumed by the after-images of the blinding blue beam. The fundamental laws of his universe had been shattered, and Kalen felt a desperate primal need to stay close to the epicenter of this new, terrifying reality. He crested the final ridge, looking down into the sprawling, miserable expanse of the city. Osen was less of a city and more of a desperate, overflowing cage. Tens of thousands of Earth Kingdom citizens, displaced by the relentless march of the Fire Nation, were crammed into a claustrophobic labyrinth of canvas tents, rusted corrugated metal shacks, and hastily erected stone barricades. The stench of unwashed bodies, burning dung fires, and sheer pervasive despair drifted up the canyon walls in a thick, choking haze. Kalen carefully scrambled down the treacherous rocky incline, bypassing the heavily guarded main gates by squeezing through a forgotten drainage fissure he had used during his smuggling days. He dropped into a narrow, mud-slicked alleyway, the sounds of crying infants and coughing elders immediately washing over him by. The atmosphere in Osen was always tense, but this morning the air was vibrating with a new, frantic energy. Whispers were tearing through the crowded marketplaces like a localized wildfire. The refugees were pointing up at the sky, speaking in hushed, terrified tones about a missing mountain peak and a blinding, localized sun that had turned the night into day. Kalen pulled the hood of his tattered cloak over his head, weaving through the dense, panicked crowds with practiced invisibility. He didn't need to ask where the Avatar was hiding. He simply followed the subtle, invisible currents of awe and fear radiating from the highest tier of the quarry. There, resting on a wide, flat expanse of reinforced bedrock meant for heavy siege engines, was the massive six-legged form of the flying bison. Appa was chewing lazily on a bale of stolen hay, completely oblivious to the geopolitical nightmare his passengers had brought to the city. Kalen crept up the carved stone stairwell, pressing his back against a cold, damp limestone pillar. From his elevated vantage point, he had a clear, unobstructed view of the impromptu war council taking place on the landing pad. Aang, Katara, and Sokka were surrounded by the grim, heavily scarred leaders of the Osen militia. The Earth Kingdom officers were shouting, their faces purple with outrage and terror, demanding to know why the Avatar had brought the wrath of Princess Azula directly to their fragile, undefended doorstep. But Kalen's eyes were not on the screaming generals or the defensive Avatar. His gaze was entirely locked onto the boy in the torn purple guy. Gohan was sitting on the edge of the stone platform, his legs dangling over the massive drop to the city below. The goofy, innocent smile that had charmed the forest was completely, utterly gone. In its place was a heavy, suffocating aura of profound misery. Gohan's shoulders were slumped, his untidy black hair hanging low over his teal eyes. He wasn't radiating golden lightning or white fire. He was radiating the crushing, paralyzing guilt of a god who had just realized the fragility of the mortals beneath his feet. He stared down at the tens of thousands of desperate, starving people packed into the canyon, his superhuman hearing undoubtedly picking up every single cough, every whimper, and every heartbeat. Kalen watched the boy's hands tremble slightly. Gohan had saved a village, but in doing so, he had violently exposed this massive, helpless population to the most ruthless military machine in history. The boy was beginning to understand that in this war, absolute power did not guarantee absolute salvation. Aang stepped away from the screaming militia leaders, his young face lined with an exhaustion that belonged on an old man. He walked over to Gohan, sitting down beside the alien boy, offering a quiet, solemn solidarity. Kalen strained his ears, catching fragments of their hushed conversation over the din of the panicked city. Gohan was apologizing. He was frantically trying to explain that he never meant to draw the firebenders here, that he was used to fighting in empty wastelands, not in places where the air was thick with innocent lives. Aang placed a gentle hand on Gohan's shoulder, his voice remarkably steady as he explained the brutal, unavoidable mathematics of their reality. The Fire Nation did not need an excuse to burn a city, they only needed a target. Gohan's light hadn't created their cruelty, it had simply illuminated it. Kalen felt a strange, painful lump form in his throat. From afar, the Golden God was a terrifying, apocalyptic weapon. But sitting here, hunched over the edge of a precipice, Gohan was just a terrified, displaced child being crushed by the immense, unforgiving weight of the world's expectations. The quiet, tragic moment of solidarity was violently, abruptly shattered by a sound that made Kalen's blood freeze in his veins. It was a low, mechanical, thrumming hum that did not come from the ground, but from the pale, overcast sky. The hum rapidly escalated into a deafening rhythmic roar vibrating the ancient limestone pillars of the quarry. The ambient sunlight suddenly died, replaced by a massive creeping shadow that swallowed the entire canyon in a sudden freezing darkness. Kalen looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The clouds were physically parting, pushed aside by the sheer overwhelming mass of the incoming threat. It wasn't a fleet of standard airships. It was a singular, monstrous armada of heavily armored, interconnected floating fortress barges, suspended by colossal gas-filled envelopes, painted with the jagged crimson insignia of the Fire Lord. The armada was so impossibly wide that it completely eclipsed the sky above Osen, acting as a mechanized lid sealing the canyon from above. The ultimate retaliation had arrived, and it was engineered for absolute, indiscriminate extermination. Panic erupted with the explosive force of a detonating bomb. The tens of thousands of refugees trapped in the canyon below began to scream a unified, deafening choir of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed off the quarry walls like physical blows. A massive, violent stampede instantly formed, people trampling over each other in a futile, desperate attempt to reach the narrow, heavily reinforced drainage tunnels. Kalen pressed himself flat against the limestone pillar, his heart hammering against his ribs, watching the sheer, chaotic horror unfold. High above the chaos, the belly doors of the interconnected fortresses slowly began to grind open with a screeching metallic groan. Kalen squinted against the gloom, his eyes widening as he recognized the payload. Suspended in massive iron-wrought cradles were hundreds of colossal spherical glass vats. The vats were filled with a thick, glowing neon-green substance, blasting jelly. It was the most volatile, destructive chemical compound the Fire Nation possessed. A single barrel could level a city block. The Armada was holding enough concentrated explosive power to physically crack the canyon in half and vaporize every single living soul trapped inside. The deafening roar of the engines was suddenly drowned out by a sound infinitely more terrifying. It was the silken, venomous, amplified voice of Princess Azula, projected through massive brass acoustic horns mounted on the flagship's hull. Her voice rolled down the canyon walls like a physical avalanche, utterly devoid of panic, vibrating with a cold, sociopathic amusement. She did not address the Avatar. She did not address the militia. She spoke directly to the boy in the purple GI. She cordially invited the Golden Anomaly to look very, very closely at the propulsion systems keeping her Armada afloat. She practically purred into the microphone, explaining that she had quickly realized her standard engines were entirely too loud and prone to being easily vaporized, so she had made a swift tactical adjustment to the fleet's altitude rotors. Kalen's sharp eyes darted upward, scanning the exposed massive mechanical gears churning beneath the gas envelopes. When his vision finally focused, a wave of profound acidic nausea hit him so hard he almost vomited. The massive iron altitude rotors were not being powered by coal furnaces. They were being turned by human muscle. Chained to the massive churning treadmill mechanisms, suspended hundreds of feet in the freezing air, were hundreds of Earth Kingdom prisoners of war. They were dressed in the familiar ragged brown uniforms of the Fire Nation labor camps. They were exhausted, emaciated, and crying, their bare hands bleeding against the heavy iron cranks. Azula's amplified voice laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that cut through the screams of the city. She laid out the rules of her new game with devastating clarity. The Armada was going to drop the blasting jelly and turn Osen into a sea of glass. If the Golden Boy tried to vaporize the fleet with his blinding light, he would instantly incinerate hundreds of innocent Earth Kingdom prisoners, serving as the fleet's organic engines. Furthermore, the massive gas envelopes were entirely rigged to detonate if boarded or tampered with. It was an inescapable, perfect moral trap. Destroy the ships and he becomes a mass murderer. Do nothing and the city burns. There was no third option. The sheer agonizing weight of the dilemma hit Gohan like a physical concussive blow. Kalen watched the boy stumble backward, his hands flying up to grip his own hair, his teal eyes wide with a frantic, paralyzing horror. The absolute unyielding morality of his nature, the desperate need to protect every single innocent life, was actively being weaponized against him. Gohan looked down at the screaming, trampling masses of the city, and then looked up at the weeping chained prisoners dangling from the infernal machines above. His white aura flared violently, an erratic, jagged manifestation of his internal panic, but he didn't launch himself into the sky. He was completely, utterly frozen by the paralyzing fear of pulling the trigger. He could break mountains, but he could not break his own moral code. Azula knew exactly what she was doing. She had found the god's singular fatal weakness, his humanity. The amplified voice commanded the fleet to commence the bombardment. The iron cradles groaned, and the first wave of massive glowing green vats detached from the hulls, plummeting silently toward the crowded, screaming quarry below. The paralysis broke, but the moral debate did not. Gohan screamed a sound of pure, desperate agony and launched himself off the stone platform. He moved with a speed that entirely defied visual tracking, breaking the sound barrier in a fraction of a second. He did not aim for the ships. He aimed for the falling bombs. Kalen watched in breathless, terrifying awe as Gohan intercepted the first massive vat of blasting jelly in midair, catching the glass sphere with agonizing surgical precision to prevent it from cracking. He violently hurled the explosive into the empty wasteland miles beyond the canyon walls, where it detonated with a deafening, earth-shaking boom. He instantly vanished, reappearing under a second bomb, then a third, catching and throwing them with the frantic, desperate energy of a boy trying to catch falling rain. But the sheer, relentless volume of the payload was completely overwhelming. The Armada was releasing dozens of vats per second. Gohan was moving so fast the friction was burning his clothes and drawing blood from his skin, but it was a mathematically impossible task. Down in the muddy alleys of Osen, the stampede was reaching a terminal, lethal density. Kalen had abandoned his hiding spot, thrown entirely into the chaotic, crushing tide of terrified bodies. He was shoved against a stone wall, the air being squeezed from his lungs by the pressing weight of the panicking crowd. He looked up, his eyes watering from the dust and the pressure. He saw Gohan, a frantic blur of white light, desperately trying to save them, but Kalen could see the horrific truth. A massive glowing green vat had slipped past the boy's defenses. It was plummeting directly toward the densely packed central marketplace. Kalen didn't just see a bomb, he saw his own inevitable agonizing death. He saw the deaths of the children clinging to their mothers. He saw the absolute, undeniable failure of trying to save everyone. Kalen's worldview, forged in the brutal, unforgiving fires of survival, crystallized in a single agonizing moment of absolute clarity. The cost of victory was always blood. The only choice was whose blood it would be. Kalen violently shoved his way out of the crushing throng, scrambling up the side of a rusted, abandoned siege tower sitting near the canyon wall. He climbed with the frantic, single-minded intensity of a cornered animal, ignoring the splintering wood tearing at his fingernails. He reached the top platform, standing entirely exposed beneath the falling shadows of the explosive vats. He spotted a discarded heavy brass communication horn used by the militia to issue orders over the noise of the city. Kalen hoisted the massive horn, pressing his bleeding lips against the mouthpiece. He aimed it directly up at the frantic white streak of light, desperately juggling the falling bombs. Kalen took a deep, agonizing breath, filling his lungs with the smell of sulfur and fear, and he screamed with every ounce of physical and emotional strength his battered 14-year-old body possessed. His voice, amplified by the brass horn, cut through the deafening roar of the explosives and the panicking crowd, sharp, ragged, and undeniably desperate. "Burn the ships!" Kalen's voice echoed off the canyon walls, a horrific, unnatural command that sliced through the chaos. High above the white blur abruptly halted. Gohan floated in the center of the falling bombs, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically locking onto the tiny figure standing on the siege tower. Kalen didn't hesitate. He didn't let the boy retreat back into his impossible, pristine morality. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger up at the colossal armada blocking the sun. "They are dead. The prisoners are already dead. You can't catch them all if you don't burn the ships. The kids down here are going to burn. Look at us, do it. Kill them and save us." Kalen's words were a brutal, unforgiving violation of everything Gohan stood for. It was the absolute, ugly truth of war vomited directly into the face of a god. The boy from the stars was being ordered by the boy from the dirt to commit an atrocity in the name of salvation. Kalen lowered the horn, tears streaming freely down his soot-stained cheeks, knowing that he had just condemned hundreds of his own people to an agonizing death. The silence that followed Kalen's scream seemed to stretch for an eternity, suspending the canyon in a localized vacuum of time. Gohan hung in the air, surrounded by the plummeting spheres of neon green death. He looked down at Kalen, reading the absolute harrowing certainty in the Earth Kingdom boy's eyes. Then slowly, agonizingly, Gohan looked up at the hundreds of chained, weeping prisoners suspended from the iron rotors. They were looking back at him. Some were crying, some were shaking their heads, begging for their lives. But a few, the older men who wore the deepest scars of the labor camps, were nodding. They knew the math. They knew the cost. Gohan's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated devastation. Tears thick and heavy spilled from his teal eyes, instantly vaporizing against the heat of his flaring aura. The goofy, innocent boy died in that exact microscopic fraction of a second. The reality of the irreversible step crushed his soul. He could not be perfect. He had to be the monster Azula wanted him to be in order to save the city. Gohan threw his arms wide open, his body convulsing as a low, agonizing scream tore from his throat. He did not summon the focused surgical beam of the Kamehameha. That would be too slow. He needed widespread, indiscriminate, absolute annihilation. He brought his hands above his head, the palms facing the massive metal belly of the armada. A blinding, intense sphere of golden energy ignited above him, completely different from the white aura of his defense. It crackled with furious, destructive, jagged lightning. The sheer atmospheric pressure of the gathering ki cracked the glass of the remaining falling vats, detonating them harmlessly in midair. Gohan's scream escalated into a deafening, earth-shattering roar of pure, bottomless grief. Masenko! He threw his hands forward, unleashing a colossal, expanding shockwave of pure, golden, explosive energy that completely engulfed the entire sky. The visual and acoustic horror of the impact defied human comprehension. The golden wave did not pierce the armada. It consumed it. The localized blast radius was so unimaginably massive that it simultaneously struck every single interconnected fortress barge. The heavily armored hulls, the massive gas envelopes, and the volatile payload of blasting jelly instantly violently detonated in a chain reaction that turned the atmosphere into a blinding, superheated sea of golden and green plasma. Kalen squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears, but the sheer concussive force of the explosion physically threw him off the siege tower. He slammed into the muddy ground, the breath driven entirely from his lungs. The heat washed over the canyon, singing the hair on Kalen's arms, but the localized blast was directed entirely upward, shielding the city from the incinerating thermal wave. But Kalen could not unhear the sound. Beneath the deafening roar of exploding metal and detonating jelly, he heard the sharp, instantaneous screams of the chained prisoners. They were burning. They were dying because Gohan pulled the trigger, and they were dying because Kalen told him to. When the golden light finally faded, and the terrifying, deafening echoes of the explosion rolled away across the valley, an unnatural, haunting silence fell over Osen. Kalen slowly, painfully pushed himself up from the mud. The sky above the canyon was no longer blocked by a mechanized armada. The clouds were gone, burned away by the sheer heat of the blast. The sun shone down on the city, casting a pale, cold light. But it wasn't raining water, it was raining ash. Thick, heavy flakes of gray and black soot. The incinerated remains of iron canvas and human bone drifted softly down upon the tens of thousands of silent, awestruck refugees. Kalen held out a trembling hand, watching a flake of ash land on his palm and smear into a dark, ugly stain. The city was completely untouched. Not a single bomb had reached the ground. Tens of thousands of lives had been saved. But the cost was raining down upon their heads, a permanent, undeniable testament to the atrocity that had just been committed in their name. A heavy, sickening thud echoed near the base of the siege tower. Kalen turned his head, his vision blurred with tears and dust. Gohan had landed. The alien boy had dropped to his hands and knees in the thick, foul-smelling mud of the alleyway. The golden aura was entirely gone. His hair was black, plastered to his forehead with sweat and soot. Gohan was violently, convulsively vomiting onto the ground, his body shaking with uncontrollable, agonizing sobs. He was weeping with a profound, terrifying brokenness that made Kalen's own heart physically ache. The boy who could shatter stars was entirely destroyed by the weight of 500 lives he had deliberately chosen to end. Kalen walked slowly over to the kneeling god, his bare feet crunching softly in the fresh layer of falling ash. He did not offer comfort. He did not apologize. He simply stood beside Gohan, looking at the gray snow falling over the saved city. The line had been crossed. The moral innocence was dead. The what-if had been answered, and the brutal truth was that to fight monsters in a broken world, even a god had to be willing to stain his hands with innocent blood. The gray snow did not melt when it touched Kalen's skin. It smeared. It was a greasy, heavy particulate that clung to his tattered clothes and coated the muddy alleyway in a suffocating monochromatic blanket. It was the physical residue of a moral absolute being violently ripped apart. Kalen stared at his own trembling hands, his fingernails caked with dirt and now dusted with the incinerated remains of 500 innocent men. He breathed in, and the back of his throat burned with a horrific metallic tang. It was the smell of vaporized iron, scorched canvas, and something fundamentally organic that his brain desperately tried to categorize as roasted pork, even though he knew the horrifying truth. The tens of thousands of refugees surrounding him in the sprawling canyon of Osen were completely silent. The deafening, crushing stampede had abruptly ceased, replaced by a collective, paralyzed stare aimed at the empty sky. They were alive. Their children were not glassed into the bedrock, but the profound, suffocating weight of the ash raining down upon them was a clear, undeniable receipt for their survival. Kalen realized with a cold, sickening clarity that his voice had signed that receipt. Gohan was still on his hands and knees in the foul, stinking mud. The boy who possessed the power to unmake reality was currently entirely incapable of supporting his own body weight. He was shivering violently, his shredded purple gi soaked through with dirty water and sweat. He was not throwing up anymore. There was nothing left in his stomach. Instead, he was dry heaving, a hollow, agonizing sound that echoed off the damp limestone walls of the alley. Every single convulsion was a physical manifestation of his fractured soul. Kalen did not know the specifics of Gohan's past. He didn't know about the androids or the biological nightmare named Cell, but Kalen knew trauma. He recognized the look of a mind furiously attempting to reject an action it had already committed. Gohan's teal eyes were completely dilated, staring blankly into the gray slush beneath his palms. He was trapped in the microscopic fraction of a second before the blast, eternally listening to the phantom screams of the chained prisoners. The golden aura, the brilliant white light of his innate goodness, was entirely extinguished. He was just a kid, thousands of light years from home, crushed by a sin he could never undo. A heavy, rhythmic gust of wind finally broke the oppressive silence of the falling ash. The massive flying bison descended through the haze, its 6 legs paddling slowly, as if the air itself had become thick and resistant. Appa landed heavily on the reinforced stone platform above the alley, his deep, rumbling groan echoing with an unnatural sadness. Kalen looked up. The Avatar and his friends did not look like triumphant heroes returning to a saved city. They looked like ghosts. Katara slipped off the saddle, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming freely down her dark face as the gray flakes settled into her braided hair. Sokka did not draw his boomerang. He simply stared at the empty sky, his jaw slack, the tactical, logical part of his brain entirely short-circuiting against the sheer apocalyptic scale of the violence. But it was Aang's reaction that made Kalen's chest physically ache. The 12-year-old monk, the ultimate embodiment of pacifism and spiritual harmony, stepped slowly to the edge of the stone platform. Aang did not look at the saved city. He did not look at the untouched refugee tents. He held out his small, tattooed hand, catching a single heavy flake of black ash. The avatar closed his eyes, and a tear traced a clean line through the soot on his cheek. For a monk raised to believe that all life was sacred, that even a spider fly deserved mercy, the localized annihilation of a massive Fire Nation fleet was horrifying enough. But the spiritual weight of the 500 chained Earth Kingdom souls was a crushing physical burden. Aang fell to his knees on the stone edge, clutching his wooden glider staff to his chest, and began to weep. It was a quiet, devastating sound. It wasn't an accusation directed at Gohan. It was a pure, unfiltered mourning for the catastrophic failure of the world. Kalin watched the boy in the mud and the boy on the wall, the savior of the universe and the savior of the world, both entirely broken by the brutal, uncompromising reality of war. The moral high ground had been completely incinerated, and they were all just standing in the ashes. But the grief was a luxury the canyon would not allow them to keep. The silence of the city was suddenly broken by the sharp, coordinated clatter of military steel. Kalin's head snapped toward the main thoroughfare. Marching through the gray, slushy mud was a massive contingent of the Osen Earth Kingdom militia. There were hundreds of them clad in heavy green and gold armor, moving with a tense, terrified urgency. They were not cheering. They were not running to embrace the alien boy who had just shielded them from an ocean of blasting jelly. They were moving in a tight defensive phalanx, their heavy iron shields interlocked, their long, barbed spears leveled outward in a lethal wall of points. Flanking the infantry were dozens of crossbowmen, their heavy weapons already loaded, cranked tight, and aimed directly at the alleyway. Kalin's survival instincts instantly flared. He knew the look in those soldiers' eyes. It wasn't the look of gratitude. It was the wild, unpredictable, hyper-aggressive look of cornered animals staring at an apex predator. At the head of the formation was General Fong, a heavily scarred, brutally pragmatic commander who had spent the last 5 years watching his country burn piece by piece. He halted his troops 10 paces from where Gohan was kneeling. Fong did not lower his sword. He stared at the shivering boy in the purple guy, his eyes darting nervously to the empty sky, then back to the mud. The general took a deep, shaky breath, projecting his voice so it echoed off the limestone walls. He did not thank Gohan. He called him an abomination. Fong's voice trembled with a mixture of absolute terror and rigid military authority as he loudly declared that no human, no spirit, and no bender should possess the power to vaporize a fleet in a single breath. The logic of the military mind was brutally simple and entirely devoid of nuance. If this alien could incinerate the Fire Nation armada and hundreds of his own people without hesitation, then the walls of Osen were entirely meaningless. Gohan wasn't a savior to them. He was a walking extinction event. He was a demon wearing a child's face. General Fong barked a harsh command, and the perimeter of spearmen tightened completely, boxing Kalin and Gohan into the muddy corner of the alley. The crossbowmen shifted their aim, locking the heavy iron bolts dead onto Gohan's chest and head. Fong demanded the boy's immediate surrender. He ordered Gohan to submit to heavy iron chains and be thrown into the deepest, darkest isolation cell beneath the quarry or face immediate execution. Kalin felt a hot, blinding surge of furious disbelief claw its way up his throat. The sheer, unfathomable audacity of the demand was sickening. These soldiers had cowered behind their walls while the armada loomed. They had done absolutely nothing as the explosive vats fell. And now, seconds after being saved from absolute annihilation, their first instinct was to cage the god who took the bullet for them. Kalin looked at Gohan, waiting for the boy to stand up. He waited for the golden light to return, for Gohan to swat these ungrateful, pathetic soldiers away like bothersome flies. But Gohan didn't flare his ki. He didn't even look angry. The boy slowly pushed himself up from the mud, his movements heavy and sluggish like an old man carrying a mountain on his back. He stood there dripping with gray slush, his head bowed in absolute defeat. He looked at the ring of leveled spears and the loaded crossbows. Then slowly, deliberately, Gohan raised his hands and crossed his wrists in front of his chest, offering himself to the chains. He was surrendering. He believed the general. He believed he was a monster. The crushing weight of the 500 dead prisoners convinced him that he deserved to be locked in the dark. The moral perfectionist could not live with the stain on his soul, and so he welcomed the punishment of lesser men. A collective gasp of shock rippled through the militia. They hadn't actually expected the god to yield. 2 heavily armored guards stepped forward, holding thick, rusted iron shackles, their hands trembling violently as they approached the boy who broke the sky. Kalen snapped. The profound, transformative shift that had been building inside him since the forest finally erupted. He was no longer the terrified runaway hiding behind roots. He was no longer the passive victim waiting for the fire to consume him. He was the boy who had looked up at the sky and ordered a god to kill. He owned the blood, and he refused to let this broken, beautiful alien carry the blame alone. Kalen moved faster than he had ever moved in his life. He threw himself forward, stepping directly between Gohan and the advancing guards. Kalen spread his arms wide, his tattered cloak snapping in the cold wind, putting his own fragile, unarmored chest right in front of the lethal spear points. The guards flinched, halting their advance. Kalen didn't look at Gohan. He locked eyes directly with the towering General Fong. The 14-year-old street rat glared at the hardened commander with an intensity that burned hotter than Azula's blue fire. Kalen's voice, raw and ragged from screaming through the horn, echoed through the dead silence of the alley. He didn't whisper, he roared. He pointed a dirt-caked finger at the general's polished armor. He screamed that they were all hypocrites. He yelled that they were perfectly happy to hide in their holes and let the Fire Nation slaughter them, but the second someone actually did what was necessary to save their pathetic lives, they called him a monster. Kalen took a step forward, his chest almost touching the tip of a guard's spear. He confessed loud enough for the entire city to hear. He screamed that Gohan hadn't wanted to do it. He screamed that it was his voice, his command, that forced the boy to pull the trigger. I told him to burn the ships. Kalen's voice cracked, tears of absolute defiant rage streaking through the ash on his face. If you want to chain the monster, chain me. He saved your city because you were too weak to do it yourselves. He ruined his own soul so you could keep breathing. You don't get to judge him. The absolute raw venom of Kalen's defense paralyzed the militia. General Fong stared at the furious, filthy teenager, completely caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the human shield. Behind Kalen, Gohan slowly raised his head. The boy's teal eyes, previously dead and hollow, widened in profound shock. He looked at the back of Kalen's tattered cloak. The human boy who had absolutely zero power, no bending and no ki, was standing down an entire army to protect an indestructible god. The absolute absurdity and profound loyalty of the act sent a strange vital shockwave through Gohan's shattered psyche. Kalen was sharing the burden. He was dividing the unbearable weight of the sin. The crushing, isolated loneliness of the atrocity was suddenly pierced by the fierce, protective rage of a mortal who understood the ugly, necessary mathematics of survival. Before General Fong could recover his composure and order Kalen to be violently removed, a horrific mechanical screech ripped through the canyon. It wasn't the sound of an engine. It was the distorted, static-filled shriek of a surviving brass acoustic relay horn. One of the massive communication devices from the flagship had apparently survived the golden blast, plummeted into the city, and crashed through the roof of a nearby warehouse. The device was heavily damaged, sparking with erratic residual energy, but it was still receiving a signal from a distant, secure frequency. The static cleared, replaced by a sound that made the blood freeze in Kalen's veins all over again. It was the silken, venomous, utterly chilling laughter of Princess Azula. She wasn't dead. She hadn't been on the Armada. She had orchestrated the entire bombardment from a safe, elevated vantage point miles away, entirely anticipating that her fleet would be vaporized. She had sacrificed her own ships and soldiers just to break the mind of the alien. Azula's voice, warped and metallic through the damaged horn, washed over the terrified city. She sounded profoundly amused. She mockingly applauded the golden anomaly for finally embracing his true nature. She congratulated him on joining the ranks of the monsters. Her psychological strike was flawlessly calculated to salt the fresh wound. But she didn't stop at gloating. Azula's tone shifted, dropping the amusement and adopting a cold, absolute lethality. She announced her next move. She casually informed the broken god and the trembling militia that the Armada was merely a distraction, a test of character. While he was busy incinerating prisoners in Osen, her primary siege force, armed with the newly constructed massive mechanized drill, had just crossed the outer wall of Ba Sing Se. The Earth Kingdom capital, a city of millions, was currently under direct, unstoppable assault. Azula's voice whispered through the static, a horrific challenge aimed directly at Gohan's bleeding soul. She told him that Ba Sing Se would burn to the bedrock by tomorrow night, and she dared the hero to come and try to catch all the bodies. The acoustic horn violently sparked and died, plunging the alley back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The militia soldiers lowered their spears slightly, the immediate fear of Gohan entirely eclipsed by the apocalyptic news. Ba Sing Se was the impenetrable heart of the world. If it fell, the war was permanently over. Kalen slowly turned around to look at Gohan. The boy was no longer crying. The violent shivering had stopped entirely. Gohan stood up straight. His posture was no longer slumped with defeat. The innocent, goofy kid from the banyan grove was dead and buried beneath the ash. The panicked, desperate teenager who juggled falling bombs was gone. What remained was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly focused. Gohan's teal eyes hardened into chips of pure, unyielding ice. The fundamental nature of his power shifted. He did not flare his golden lightning or his blinding white aura. Instead, a heavy, suffocating, invisible pressure settled over the alleyway. It was the dense, terrifying gravity of a warrior who had accepted the absolute brutal necessity of becoming a weapon. Gohan walked past Kalen, completely ignoring the militia, and looked up at the avatar on the wall. The time for holding back was permanently over. The god was going to war. The wind howling over the jagged rim of the Osen quarry felt fundamentally different to Kalen now. It no longer carried the scent of roasted meat or the desperate clinging hope of the refugee camps. It smelled like cold iron and impending absolute violence. The Earth Kingdom militia, still trembling behind their barricades of interlocked shields and loaded crossbows, did not make a single move to stop them as the massive flying bison prepared for takeoff. General Fong's harsh, authoritarian bravado had been completely hollowed out by Kalen's furious defense and the chilling, static-laced broadcast of Princess Azula. The soldiers simply lowered their weapons, parting like a frightened school of fish as Kalen trudged through the gray, slushy ash toward the reinforced landing pad. His bare feet were numb, bleeding from the sharp limestone, but he refused to look back at the tens of thousands of silent, staring people he had just helped save at the cost of his own soul. Kalen gripped the thick, coarse fur of the bison's leg and hauled himself up onto the heavy leather saddle. He did not ask for permission to join the Avatar. He did not care that he was a powerless 14-year-old street rat inserting himself into a clash of gods and warlords. The boy in the torn purple GI had taken Kalen's horrific, desperate command and turned it into a localized apocalypse to save Kalen's people. An unbreakable, blood-forged tether now existed between the mortal boy and the alien weapon. Where Gohan went, Kalen would follow, if only to serve as the singular human anchor, reminding the god that the world beneath his feet was still worth bleeding for. Aang did not argue. The young monk, his face streaked with tears, and Phut simply offered Kalen a silent, solemn nod, pulling the heavy leather reins with a grim, heavy finality. Appa groaned a deep, mournful sound that vibrated in Kalen's chest and launched himself into the overcast sky, leaving the ash-covered city of Osen behind. The flight toward Ba Sing Se was consumed by a suffocating, terrifying silence. Katara sat near the massive reins, her hands wrapped tightly around her knees, staring blankly at the swirling clouds. Sokka sharpened his boomerang with a mechanized, repetitive intensity, the sharp shk-shk of the whetstone, the only sound competing with the rushing wind. But Kalen's attention was entirely fixated on the back of the saddle. Gohan did not fly alongside the bison wrapped in a brilliant white aura. He did not waste a single microscopic fraction of his ki on showing off. He sat perfectly cross-legged on the heavy leather, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow and measured that his chest barely seemed to rise. The violent, hyper-reactive emotional volatility that had defined him in the banyan grove was completely gone. The agonizing, convulsive weeping in the mud of Osen had burned away the last remnants of his innocence. What sat on the saddle now was terrifyingly dense. Gohan's internal energy wasn't leaking out as glowing light. It was being violently, deliberately compressed inward. He felt like a localized black hole, a singularity of pure, absolute kinetic potential just waiting for the mathematical coordinate to detonate. As the flying bison broke through the thick, low-hanging cloud cover, the sheer geographical scale of their destination finally became visible on the horizon. Kalen had heard the legends of Ba Sing Se his entire life, the impenetrable city, the final bastion of humanity. But seeing it from the air physically stole the breath from his lungs. The outer wall was not a wall. It was a man-made mountain range of seamless, dark gray bedrock, stretching infinitely in both directions, curving gently with the curvature of the earth itself. It was hundreds of feet thick and towered so high it scraped the belly of the storm clouds. Behind it lay thousands of square miles of lush, agrarian farmland, feeding a city so impossibly massive it had its own internal weather systems. It was a monument to the absolute unyielding defiance of the Earth Kingdom. But as Appa drew closer, the horrifying reality of Azula's broadcast painted a dark, bleeding scar across the pristine stone. The outer wall was failing. The visual and acoustic scale of the assault was apocalyptic. A localized, deafening mechanical heartbeat roared across the plains, drowning out the wind and the thunder. It was the sound of grinding, screaming metal and shattering tectonic plates. Parked directly against the base of the colossal wall was a machine that defied all rational engineering. It was a mechanized Leviathan, a massive, heavily armored, cylindrical Fire Nation drill, easily the length of 3 naval dreadnoughts laid end to end. Its hull was forged from thick, jagged black iron, bristling with exhaust pipes, vomiting thick, choking columns of black smoke into the atmosphere. But the true horror was the front of the machine. A colossal, rotating cutting head studded with diamond-hardened steel teeth was currently violently chewing its way into the impenetrable bedrock of Ba Sing Se. Sparks the size of houses cascaded off the wall in a blinding localized meteor shower. The drill was not just scratching the surface, it was already halfway through the outer layer. The defense of the wall was a chaotic, desperate slaughter. Thousands of Earth Kingdom soldiers lined the colossal parapets, desperately hurling massive boulders, trenches of boiling oil, and concentrated artillery fire down upon the iron beast. But the Fire Nation had anticipated the vertical assault. The back of the drill functioned as a massive deploying fortress. Hundreds of heavily armored Fire Nation tanks had rolled out of the Leviathan's rear bay, forming an impenetrable, bristling defensive perimeter of concentrated artillery. Volleys of massive screaming fireballs arched up into the sky, slamming into the top of the wall and violently incinerating the Earth Kingdom defenders. Kalen watched in absolute paralyzed horror as an entire battalion of Earthbenders was simply washed away by a rolling wave of superheated plasma. The impenetrable city was bleeding out, and the sheer unstoppable momentum of the mechanical monster meant that the agrarian zone and the millions of innocent civilians living inside were mere hours away from being overrun. Appa descended rapidly the violent thermal updrafts from the burning battlefield, making the massive bison pitch and roll dangerously. Aang steered them toward a relatively intact section of the wall, hundreds of feet above the grinding apex of the drill. The moment the bison's heavy paws touched the blood-stained stone, Kalen felt the vibrations. The entire wall was screaming, the acoustic resonance of the colossal cutting head grinding through solid rock traveled up Kalen's legs, rattling his teeth in his skull. The air tasted of pulverized granite, burning flesh, and heavy sulfur. Aang, Katara, and Sokka immediately vaulted off the saddle, drawing their weapons, their faces pale but set, with a grim, desperate resolve to aid the dying defenders. But Kalen didn't move. He stayed by the saddle, turning his head to look at the boy in the torn purple dye. Gohan slowly opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth. The deep, vibrant teal had hardened into the color of a frozen glacier. He did not look at the dying soldiers. He did not look at the massive fireballs raining down from the sky. He looked directly down at the churning, screeching mechanical head of the drill. The absolute heavy silence surrounding Gohan was violently broken. He did not scream. He did not shout a battle cry. He simply stepped off the massive leather saddle and walked to the edge of the parapet. Kalen rushed to the stone lip, peering over the edge. Just as Gohan stepped off the wall, the boy did not fly forward. He simply let gravity take him. He fell like a dropped stone, a tiny, insignificant speck, plummeting directly toward the colossal rotating maw of the Fire Nation's ultimate weapon. Inside the elevated, heavily armored command bridge at the crown of the drill, Princess Azula stood with her hands casually clasped behind her back. She was not wearing her pristine royal armor. She was dressed in a sleek crimson and black combat suit, her amber eyes reflecting the blinding sparks of the grinding stone. She was watching the tactical maps with the cold, detached boredom of a grandmaster playing against an infant. Her elite enforcers, Mai and Tai Li, stood silently behind her, flanked by a dozen high-ranking Fire Nation engineers, furiously monitoring the pressure gauges. Azula smiled a thin, razor-sharp expression of absolute victory. The wall was yielding. The structural integrity was mathematically compromised. The Earth Kingdom capital, the city that had defied her uncle for 600 days, was going to crack open for her in less than an hour. She had won the war. Princess, a terrified engineer, stammered, his face pale in the glow of the boiler dials. "We have an anomaly. An object is descending from the upper parapet. It's falling directly into the path of the primary cutting head." Azula's smile widened. She didn't need a spyglass to know what the object was. The acoustic horn in Osen had done its job perfectly. She had broken the alien's mind, forced him to slaughter his own kind, and now, fueled by irrational, pathetic grief, he was throwing himself into the gears of her invincible machine. It was a mathematically perfect suicide. "Maintain forward thrust." Azula ordered, her voice silken and entirely devoid of concern. "Let the golden anomaly try to punch a machine that weighs 10,000 tons. He will be violently ground into a fine paste, and we will pave our road into Ba Sing Se with his ashes." Down at the base of the wall, Kalen watched the microscopic speck of purple fabric vanish into the deafening, chaotic storm of sparks and smoke enveloping the drill's cutting head. Kalen gripped the stone parapet so hard his fingernails bled. He waited for the deafening golden explosion. He waited for the sky to turn into a blinding sea of ki, for Gohan to unleash the Masenko and vaporize the machine. But Kalen's scream at Osen had fundamentally changed the boy's tactical operating system. Gohan knew that if he fired a massive energy wave here, the concussive localized nuclear detonation would absolutely shatter the outer wall, violently collapsing millions of tons of bedrock onto the agrarian zone and the very citizens he was trying to protect. Indiscriminate destruction was no longer an option. He had to dismantle the monster surgically. The impact did not make a sound. It was completely masked by the deafening screech of the drill. But the physical result was instantaneous and absolutely mind-bending. The colossal 10,000-ton Fire Nation drill, moving forward with the combined unstoppable thrust of 100 massive steam engines, abruptly violently halted. The sudden cessation of forward momentum defied all laws of inertia. Inside the command bridge, the sudden stop was catastrophic. The inertial dampeners completely failed. Azula was violently hurled forward, her hands slapping against the thick reinforced glass observation window. Mai and Ty Lee were thrown to the iron grating, and the engineers crashed into their consoles. The deafening rhythmic heartbeat of the machine transformed into a horrifying high-pitched metallic scream. The massive iron treads lining the underbelly of the Leviathan continued to churn, but the machine was not moving an inch. It was actively trying to push forward, and something infinitely stronger was pushing back. Azula scrambled to her feet, her immaculate composure finally fracturing. She pressed her face against the reinforced glass, staring down at the cutting head. The thick, choking smoke parted momentarily, caught in a sudden violent updraft of displaced air. Standing dead center against the colossal, diamond-hardened steel teeth of the halted cutting head was Gohan. He was not glowing. He was not transformed. His feet were planted firmly into the pulverized bedrock of the wall's base, sinking up to his shins. Both of his hands were pressed flat against the massive rotating steel face of the drill. He was physically entirely through sheer raw muscular force, holding back the combined mechanical output of the Fire Nation's greatest engineering achievement. The friction generated between his bare palms and the grinding steel was so intensely violent that the metal of the drill head was literally beginning to glow cherry red, superheating and warping around his fingers. Gohan's face was an absolute mask of terrifying cold concentration. He wasn't straining, he wasn't screaming, he was simply an immovable object acting against a highly stoppable force. Kalen, watching from the wall above, felt a cold, sharp laugh tear its way out of his throat. The Fire Nation believed power was a loud, burning inferno. They believed power required massive machines and thousands of chained slaves. But true, absolute power was just a boy from the stars deciding that he did not want to take a step backward. Gohan pushed. He didn't use a ki blast. He just flexed his arms and pushed forward. The horrific screeching groan of bending iron echoed across the entire battlefield. The colossal cutting head designed to chew through mountains violently buckled. The massive diamond steel teeth shattered like cheap porcelain, erupting outward in a lethal supersonic spray of shrapnel that tore through the Fire Nation tanks flanking the Leviathan. Inside the bridge, the pressure valves began to detonate. Reverse, reverse thrust, Azula screamed, her voice completely stripped of its silken superiority, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. The engineers frantically pulled the massive iron levers, attempting to disengage the forward drive. But it was too late. The structural integrity of the drill's vanguard had been fundamentally compromised. Gohan didn't stop pushing. He took a single, deliberate step forward, driving his hands deeper into the glowing, superheated metal of the crushed drill head. The sheer kinetic force he applied traveled down the entire longitudinal axis of the 10,000-ton machine. The thick, heavily armored iron plates making up the hull of the Leviathan began to visibly warp, ripple, and violently tear apart at the seams. It looked as though a massive invisible serpent was violently crushing the cylinder from the outside in. Realizing that forward pressure was completely ineffective, Azula desperately pivoted her strategy. "Open the forward sluice gates," she shrieked at the bleeding engineers. "Flush the slurry, drown him in the boiling rock." The drill's secondary function was to liquefy the excavated bedrock with a highly pressurized boiling slurry of water and chemical solvents. With a sickening hydraulic hiss, massive iron valves opened directly above the crushed cutting head. A colossal boiling waterfall of toxic, scalding gray mud and pulverized rock violently cascaded down, entirely burying Gohan under hundreds of tons of liquid heat. The deluge was so massive it created a localized steaming lake at the base of the wall, completely obscuring the boy from view. Azula breathed heavily, her chest heaving, her amber eyes wide as she watched the steaming lake. If she couldn't crush him, she would boil him alive and bury him in the bedrock. But the steaming lake did not remain still. For 3 agonizing seconds, the battlefield fell silent, save for the hissing of the boiling mud. Then the center of the lake began to violently bubble. A low, resonant synthetic hum vibrated through the air, completely different from the mechanical screech of the drill. It was the sound Kalin had heard in the banyan grove, the sound that preceded the unmaking of reality. The boiling slurry abruptly violently parted. A blinding, localized pillar of fierce, destructive blue lightning erupted from the center of the mud, instantly vaporizing the liquid into a massive cloud of superheated steam. Gohan rose from the crater completely untouched. He had not gone Super Saiyan, but his base aura had flared into a jagged, crackling outline of pure, contained rage. He looked up, his ice-cold teal eyes locking directly onto the reinforced glass of the command bridge, meeting Azula's terrified stare through the smoke. Gohan didn't just want to stop the machine, he wanted to permanently, surgically lobotomize the Fire Nation military. He crouched low, his boots cracking the bedrock beneath the slurry lake. With a concussive supersonic boom that shattered the remaining glass in the Fire Nation tanks, Gohan launched himself vertically. He tore through the thick, armored underbelly of the drill's primary neck segment, like a bullet passing through wet paper. Kalin watched, absolutely mesmerized, as a localized rapid-fire sequence of heavy, muffled detonations began to ripple down the entire spine of the Leviathan. Gohan was moving completely inside the machine. He wasn't using massive energy beams. He was physically, mathematically dismantling the internal architecture of the drill with his bare hands. He was snapping the massive iron drive shafts. He was violently crushing the primary steam boilers. He was tearing the heavily armored hydraulic pistons entirely out of their housings. The destruction was absolute, surgical, and terrifyingly efficient. The colossal machine began to systematically die from the inside out. The massive exhaust pipes choked and violently detonated, vomiting black fire into the sky. The heavy iron treads seized and shattered, locking the Leviathan in place. The entire structural frame of the drill sagged, groaning in mechanical agony as its internal skeleton was violently removed. Azula's command bridge lost all power. The emergency red lights flickered on, casting long, bloody shadows across the terrified faces of her elite guards. The princess of the Fire Nation backed away from the console, her hands trembling. She had tried to break his morality by forcing him to kill the prisoners in Osen. She had assumed that committing an atrocity would make him reckless, wild, and prone to making a mistake she could exploit. She had been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The sin hadn't made him wild. It had completely removed his hesitation. He was no longer worried about playing fair. He was simply removing the threat. With a final deafening screech of tearing metal, The entire roof of the command bridge was violently ripped away. The cold, overcast sky above Ba Sing Se suddenly poured into the dark room. Gohan hovered above the exposed bridge, holding a massive, jagged slab of the armored roof in one hand completely effortlessly. His purple GI was stained with grease and soot, but his breathing was perfectly calm. He dropped the massive slab of iron off the side of the drill, letting it crash into the dirt below. He floated down, landing softly on the grated floor of the ruined bridge, surrounded by the sparking consoles and the terrified engineers. Ty Lee and Mai immediately dropped into combat stances, but they didn't move. The sheer suffocating atmospheric pressure radiating from the boy paralyzed their muscles. They were assassins, but they knew they were standing in the presence of a god. Gohan ignored them completely. He walked slowly, deliberately across the ruined bridge, stopping 3 paces from Princess Azula. The deadliest firebender on the continent did not generate lightning. She did not summon blue fire. She simply stared at him, her chest heaving, entirely stripped of her psychological armor. She had orchestrated the deaths of 500 of his hostages, and she fully expected him to execute her on the spot. But Gohan did not raise his hand. He did not flare his Kai. He looked at her with an expression of profound, absolute pity. It was a look that cut deeper than any physical blow. He saw her for exactly what she was, a terrified, arrogant child, playing with machines she didn't understand, desperately trying to prove her worth to a father who didn't care. Gohan spoke, his voice quiet, cold, and echoing with the heavy, inescapable weight of his newly accepted role. He told her that the machine was dead. He told her that her army was broken, and then he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper that only she could hear. He informed her that the only reason she was still breathing was because killing her would be entirely too easy, and he refused to add another worthless body to the ledger he was already carrying. He instructed her to take her surviving soldiers and walk back to her Fire Lord. He told her to deliver a message. The world was no longer theirs to burn. The god had decided to intervene, and he would break every single toy they built until they learned to stop. Gohan turned his back on the princess, completely dismissing her existence, and launched himself back into the sky, leaving Azula standing in the ruined, smoking husk of her greatest failure, entirely and utterly defeated. High above the shattered battlefield, Kalen stood on the parapet of the outer wall, the harsh wind whipping his tattered cloak. The deafening roar of the drill was gone, replaced by the chaotic, disorganized retreat of the surviving Fire Nation tanks. The impenetrable city of Ba Sing Se had been deeply wounded, a massive jagged crater carved into its outer shell, but the wall had held. The millions of people living inside the agrarian zone would not burn today. Gohan landed softly beside Kalen, the heavy, suffocating aura dissipating back into the cold air. The alien boy looked out over the retreating army, his face completely unreadable. Kalen looked at the god, the boy who had shattered his own soul to save a city, and then systematically dismantled a leviathan to save a continent. The innocence was permanently gone, replaced by the grim, heavy reality of a protector who understood the cost of victory. The line had been crossed, the monster had been unleashed, and Kalen knew that the final confrontation with the Fire Lord was no longer a matter of if, but exactly when. The dying sun bled across the bruised horizon, casting a massive, jagged shadow over the smoking, decapitated corpse of the Fire Nation drill. The impenetrable outer wall of Ba Sing Se had held. Down in the muddy, shattered trenches at the base of the bedrock, the deafening, chaotic roars of thousands of Earth Kingdom soldiers erupted into the twilight air. It was a sound of absolute, unrestrained victory, a tidal wave of sheer, hysterical relief, washing away a century of inevitable grinding defeat. Men threw their heavy iron helmets high into the smoke-filled sky, weeping openly and embracing each other as the colossal iron leviathan continued to hiss, pop, and cool in the boiling mud. The acoustic shockwave of their cheering echoed off the canyon walls, a booming testament to survival. But high above the frantic celebration, sitting on the quiet, wind-swept edge of the colossal stone parapet, Kalen felt completely detached from the jubilation. He let his bruised legs dangle over the terrifying precipice, the cold, high-altitude wind whipping his tattered cloak against his shivering skin. Kalen reached deep into the pocket of his trousers and slowly pulled out the rusted carving knife he had carried for 3 miserable years. It was a pathetic, jagged piece of metal worn down by fear and desperation. For his entire life, Kalen had believed that power was synonymous with cruelty. He had believed that the universe belonged exclusively to the firebenders, the warlords, and the monsters who could burn a village just to watch the ashes dance. He had run from every shadow hoarding this useless blade, as if it could somehow stop the inevitable march of a tank. But as he ran his dirty thumb over the dull edge, listening to the distant echoing cheers of an army that had just been saved by a miracle, the knife felt incredibly light. It felt entirely obsolete. The fundamental laws of his terrifying reality had been violently rewritten in a single day. Power was no longer a genetic monopoly held by tyrants. Power was a choice. It was the internal discipline of the soul. Beside him, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone, the alien boy who had single-handedly broken the siege existed in a profound, heavy silence. Gohan was not looking down at the cheering army. He was staring intensely at his own bare hands. The thick black soot and heavy grease from the drill's internal engines stained his skin, but Kalen knew Gohan wasn't seeing the oil of Ba Sing Se. The boy was looking straight through the dirt, staring at the greasy gray ash of Osen. He was looking at the permanent indelible stain of 500 innocent lives that he had personally deliberately incinerated. The deafening cheers of the Earth Kingdom vanguard could not drown out the phantom high-pitched screams of the chained prisoners locked eternally in his mind. The military victory was absolute, but the moral defeat was entirely irreversible. There was no magical bending technique, no legendary dragon, and no glowing spirit water that could ever wash away the blood he had chosen to spill for the greater good. Kalen watched the heavy, agonizingly slow rise and fall of Gohan's chest. The golden god was physically indestructible, entirely capable of shattering mountains, catching lethal lightning, and tearing apart 10,000 tons of steel with his bare hands. But his human soul was deeply bruised and violently bleeding. He was a weapon of mass destruction burdened by the agonizing, hypersensitive conscience of a saint. Kalen closed his hand tightly around the rusted carving knife, feeling the metal bite into his palm one last time. Then, with a sudden, deliberate, and violent motion, he hurled the blade over the edge of the parapet. He watched it spin away into the darkening abyss, completely surrendering his old life of passive, paralyzing fear. Kalen shifted closer on the stone, his bare feet scraping against the rock, and closed the physical distance between himself and the god. Kalen did not offer empty, poetic platitudes. He didn't insult Gohan's intelligence by telling him that the prisoners were in a better place, or that the horrific ends justified the brutal means. The blood was real, and Kalen refused to soften it. Instead, he simply leaned his thin, unarmored shoulder firmly against the alien boy's dense, muscular arm, offering the grounding physical weight of a human anchor. Kalen spoke softly, his voice cutting clearly through the rushing wind. He told Gohan that the world was ugly and broken, and it had been bleeding out long before a boy in a purple gi fell from a tear in the sky. Kalen looked at the soot on Gohan's face and stated the brutal truth: they would both have to live with the heavy, suffocating ghosts of Osen for the rest of their natural lives. They were murderers now, bound together by the command Kalen gave, and the trigger Gohan pulled. But then Kalen raised his hand and pointed down at the vast, sprawling expanse of the agrarian zone stretching out behind the Great Wall. Millions of tiny, warm, flickering yellow lights, were slowly beginning to illuminate the darkness dotting the endless miles of safe, unbroken farmland. Kalen's voice thickened with a fierce, unapologetic emotion. He told Gohan to look at the lights. Millions of children were going to sleep in warm beds tonight, completely safe from the fire solely because the monster was willing to bear the agonizing weight of the sin. Kalen looked directly into Gohan's shattered teal eyes and promised, with the absolute unyielding certainty of a survivor who had finally stopped running, that he would never let the god carry the guilt alone. As long as Gohan used his unimaginable strength to fight for the people who couldn't, Kalen would stand beside him, acting as the memory, the conscience, and the voice that kept him tethered to the earth. Gohan slowly turned his head. The heavy, paralyzing curtain of grief in his eyes did not vanish, but it shifted into something quieter, deeper, and profoundly resolute. He looked at the 14-year-old street rat, recognizing a fierce, unbreakable human spirit that required absolutely no Kai to manifest. Kalen had no aura, but his gravity was immense. A small, sad, but undeniably genuine smile finally cracked through the thick soot on Gohan's weary face. He nodded silently, accepting the terrifying, beautiful burden of his new reality. He was no longer just a lost traveler. He was the protector of a wounded world. Heavy, soft footsteps approached from the shadows behind them. Aang, Katara, and Sokka walked onto the parapet, their faces illuminated by the pale light of the rising moon. The Avatar did not look like a frightened, fleeing child anymore. The goofy monk from the banyan grove had been replaced by a young leader, fully comprehending the immense scale of the war. Aang stepped directly beside Gohan, looking out over the conquered, smoking mechanical beast and the retreating, terrified shadows of the Fire Nation army. The young Avatar gripped his wooden glider staff tightly, his gray eyes reflecting a new, unshakable determination. He didn't ask if they were safe. He looked up at the boy who could break the sky and simply asked if it was time to begin his training. Gohan stood up, the cold wind catching his untidy black hair, his purple gi fluttering like a worn battle flag. He looked down at the Avatar, then at Kalen, and finally at the distant, darkened horizon where the Fire Lord waited on his throne. The 100-Year War was no longer a slow, bleeding execution of the innocent. It was a definitive countdown. The god had found his human anchor, the Avatar had found his master, and a terrified, broken world had finally found its absolute, unyielding hope.